Welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. I'm Tracy Ainsworth from the University of New South Wales. In this podcast series, we will talk to marine experts about the marine environments that we have right on our doorsteps and what we can do to help conserve and protect these blue spaces. Troy Johnson, welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. Troy, you're an Indigenous Ranger with the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service through Townsville Marine Parks. You're part of the Australian Rural Leadership Program. You're on the Indigenous Reef Advisory Committee with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, which is...
Soon to be.
Soon to be, yep, absolutely, which is the world's kind of leading authority on managing coral reefs. And with that, you live, work, protect the inshore islands on the Great Barrier Reef. You work all the way from Dunk Island through to Magnetic Island. That covers almost 200 kilometres of coastline, right?
Yes, and our southern edge is Cape Upstart.
When we think about the reef, we probably usually think about, the offshore reef, but these inshore spaces and islands are really important to the ecology of the reef and its future sustainability. You've often spoken really passionately about these places, and thank you so much for bringing that passion and knowledge to our podcast today. For the young people out there with a passion for spending their days in nature and who love this idea of living their life along coastlines like that, what has been your path to where you are now that you are spending every day in these beautiful places?
Yeah, sure. Look, I grew up in Charter Stowers. I was born and bred in Charter Stowers, and often we would go to places like Palm Island to see some of the extended family and the Townsville area as well. So I basically grew up in Charter Stowers in Townsville, and part of that was realising that your cultural heritage was just important as your involvement in mainstream society. So I guess you evolve as a person with age, of course. Life experiences will always shape who you are today. So look, I've always been quite comfortable on land and in sea, but I guess the last 7 years I've been more comfortable in the marine environment, and this is where my heart is, and I'm certainly both comfortable on land and sea, to tell you the truth.
And your role with the Parks and Wildlife Service is really protecting and managing both land and sea and protecting them together. For a lot of people, these ecosystems aren't distinct at the waterline, and they're not distinct from us. It's really important that people understand that their actions in both matter. How important do you think people are for those inshore islands on the Great Barrier Reef in terms of making sure that they stay intact, they retain the native flora and fauna, or even that we rewild them to what they used to be?
Yeah, look, I think we're at a point where us as Australians, we really need to build positive partnerships with traditional owners that come from those certain countries. And I think that now's the time that we have to do it. There's so many different threats to the Great Barrier Reef in particular from the Western world that we need to recognise, and we can only do that through education. And education is the key. And certainly we need to look at our land catchment plans that are in place to look at how we can both build these partnerships with traditional owners, external stakeholders as well, to look at creeks, river systems. They all play a part in what goes out into the marine environment. So we've got to recognise that, and you can only do that through education and active participation on the ground. Yeah. So we've got to do it now. We've got to take ownership because everything that we do is influence and impacting on the Great Barrier Reef and some of our inshore marine systems.
You work with a lot of volunteer programs, particularly on Maggie, managing weeds and things like that. And do you find that having volunteers is actually a really active way of building that connection between people, place, and the history of the place as well?
Yeah, definitely. At the moment, though, the COVID restrictions that are in place have certainly put a halt to a lot of things, especially throughout the world. So at the moment, the volunteer program has just ramped up. So we certainly encourage volunteers to participate in working with rangers on country, and that gives people a better understanding of the work that we do, pest management, fires, looking at feral animals like cane toads and pigs, and the damage that they do on some of our inshore islands such as Hingebrook Island, etc. But and it also gives volunteers really good insight and a chance to possibly obtain future work with Queensland Park and possibly employment as well. So exposing those people to our nature work is quite important.
What are some of the programs that I know Magnetic Island is one of the most accessible inshore islands on the Great Barrier Reef, and there's places people can stay there and get involved. What are some of the programs you've really enjoyed doing on those islands?
Yeah, I guess looking at things like how we can manage weeds on their islands to minimise the damage that they do, especially when they're highly invasive weeds that can really overtake a natural ecosystem and strangle and suffocate native species of plants and trees. So, one of the things that we look at is certainly, fire, for instance, on our prescribed burns, and how we can tip the balance in favour of native processes. But there's different reasons why we do fire as well. So it's there is a few outcomes that we look at, and a lot of this work is measured and calculated by experts in that field. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Probably a lot of people don't make that connection that fire is actually a way of encouraging native growth and managing weeds. That's really interesting. Can you expand a bit more on how that process works?
Yeah, sure. So, look, I'm at the sort of bottom end of the scale when it comes to prescribed burns and the part that I play as fire crew. Look, we have really good strategies about how we set up our fire programs, and there's a lot of things that we take into account, like the weather, and we measure, we try to measure as accurately as we can weather systems that are coming through, and if they are favourable, and we get the green light to do them, then we do them.
Yeah,
we don't always get the opportunity to do this work straight away, because the nature of our work is very weather dependent, and that also goes towards, because we do vessel work, so we've got to go by boat to these islands. Everything revolves around the weather. Yeah. Everything revolves around the tide. So we've got to get in on the tide, and we've got to get out on the tide. So we've got to look at mitigating all the safety risks that encompass that activity or that project. So.
Yeah, it's a really nice example, though, of that connection between what happens on the land and what happens in the ocean and how you manage it. Another really big part of what you guys handle is zoning. Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is probably a leader in zoning restrictions and controlling what happens where and when. For people who aren't very familiar with zoning, you work with it day to day. What's it like? What's the goal?
Yeah, look, the goal is to help maintain a sustainable future for the everyday park user out on the Great Barrier Reef, but also, we part of our duties is to enforce the zoning, the green zones, which are really, really important. The understanding the nature of the green zones and how they can help populate, certain fish species can populate from that, and they spread to the other reefs that are not green zones. So we've got to try and look at the future of the seafood industry, for instance, how we can achieve outcomes that will benefit our growth and population as well. So, at the moment the reef is very delicate, so we've got to put all these measures in place, and certainly the education is out there. It's just if people want to access the education, jump onto the Great Barrier Reef Marine Parks Authority websites or Queensland Parks, and all the information is there.
Yeah, and that's another part of your role, isn't it, is building those relationships with people and educating people about how the zoning works and how they can be part of the solution on the reef.
Yeah, definitely. Look, we're not out there to be policemen, so to speak. At the end of the day, we really want to encourage building positive relationships to people that are out there on the water, and it's part of having those conversations with people to say, what works about the zoning, what doesn't work. And all of these things, we take it in consideration and we discuss it within our teams. And, you won't get the chance to have those discussions unless you're face to face with people out in the water. So it's very important that, we do take stock of some of the thought around these things.
Yeah. Well, that's how people build those relationships and value the systems that they're in is through talking and learning, and that's very part of your role in the leadership program, the rural leadership program. Through that and through working with people and also country. What do you see as the most critical areas that do need that local leadership for inshore islands on the Great Barrier Reef?
Yeah, look, I have been in discussion with various people around this, and I think it's got to be an absolute collaborative approach between state government, local government, traditional owner groups, and look at ways that we can add value to the conversation. We can enhance and build upon strategies or policies or frameworks that are in place, and really go to that next level of collaborative thinking. I think just got to think outside the square now.
Yeah.
We basically know what most of the issues are across the Great Barrier Reef, all the way to the catchments of major river systems and stuff. And I think that opening up that discussion with stakeholders, landowners, graziers, etc., to understand exactly where they're coming from. It can't be a one-sided approach. Yep. It's got to be a two-way communication.
Well, we need people to want to be involved in the solution and see value in it, as well as seeing value in those blue places that they enjoy. Kind of being able to make that connection that they're part of the solution. Yeah.
Yes, of course. And I think there's various, look, I've been lucky enough to be exposed to some of the wonderful people behind the scenes in the marine industry, some of the scientists that I've been exposed to. Professor Sean Olm, he does modelling on sea level change. He's got a really excellent background on radiocarbon dating of marine materials. He's an archaeological scientist. He's done work on the Great Barrier Reef, the GBR.
Yeah.
The other guy I was lucky to work with is Jerry Turpin, and Marine Parks Townsville. We were lucky enough to take Jerry on our barge. So we looked at mangrove systems around the Hinchinbrook area. So we were lucky enough.
I was going to say they're a really important part of the reef as well, which people probably don't realise is that a lot of the coastline has mangroves and massive mangrove systems.
Yes, and the part that mangrove systems play is something that really that people have to fully understand why mangrove systems are so important to these inshore systems and the protection, but also stabilization, animal habitat. All of those things are vital to those systems. And look, Jerry was. I'm lucky enough to work with some of these people, and that was a good collaborative exercise between Townsville Marine Parks, Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, the Queensland Herbarium, and also the Tropical Herbarium Cairns, and also the Girrigan Rangers, who have a IPA, which is an Indigenous protection area agreement in place. So, yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's amazing. Do you have a favourite? Like you've talked about, you work in the land, you work in mangroves, you work in the sea. You do a lot of monitoring of reefs as well in what you do. Do you have a favourite?
Oh, look, I think there's quite a lot. I mean, like, families pay thousands of dollars to do some of the stuff that I do, like reef health surveys. Between on our patch from Dunk Island to Cape Upstart, we've got to do all the reef health surveys on all of our reefs.
Yeah.
So seeing some of the beautiful animals and corals and animals like that is amazing. Manta rays, stingray, whale, dolphins, you name it. But also understanding the nature of the work I do and how that is collated and what it means for the health of the Great Barrier Reef is quite important. And, to share those stories with the community and some of the kids is quite special. Like I'm always telling my friends, like Hinchinbrook Island, the walking tracks and waterfalls like Zoe and Mulligan's, I get to see them all the time, So it's a hard one. But, we are really lucky to have working partnerships with Girrigan.
Yeah.
With Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, we always extend the welcome mat, and that's awesome. It's great to have those partnerships, and I think as time goes by, I think we're going to work better together. So let's have those conversations where we add value.
Yeah, absolutely, and all those different places that knowledge comes from people who are on the water every day, from people who have traditional knowledge, from people who are really invested in what happens into the future. I mean, they're all really important voices in deciding how do we approach the problems that the reef is experiencing. And you would have seen that firsthand going to some of these inshore reefs over the last 5 years. How was that for you as a ranger?
Well, being exposed to those environments is something that money can't buy.
Yeah,
it's looking at the baselines for when there was really beautiful, active coral structures in place to where we are today. So there's all those pressures that go hand in hand that are detrimental, and it's us. It's basically us. What we do, construction, runoff, plumes, all of that. We've got all the information there. We've just got to make sure that we understand exactly what impacts they are having on those marine ecosystems, and identifying exactly how we can help and what we can do as individuals or families or communities to become essentially, reef guardians.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the perfect example that we can change systems is because it's happened, right? And it's happening right now, right in front of us. So if we can change them in that direction, we can change them back. And every little thing that people do helps. What do you think are the most important things that, like you mentioned, individuals and families and communities can do to help you manage these places?
Yeah, I think we just got to put things under the microscope, and we've got to have the right people that are passionate about looking at those things under the microscope, especially where inland catchment system plans are in place. I'm lucky enough to be talking with one of the marine scientists at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Parks Authority, Paul Groves, and he's done some interesting articles on land, water, waste and community, best practice for local government to move forward on these issues. But to add to that, I think there's got to be more conversation with landholders along these river systems, because potentially, everybody that's down that river system
contributes.
Depends on the life of that river system. So how you can help your neighbour, I think that's the most important thing, to not just intrude upon their space, so to speak, because they do own that land, but work out ways that we can utilise volunteers, we can utilise programs such as Reef Guardians programs at the Marine Park Authority, and also look at ATSIMS, which is the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander marine students. Those sort of things that I think that we can really add value, because they're the future. So, every one of us, if we don't do the hard work now, we're not going to have a future for these kids or their grandkids and so on and so on.
We just hand the problem on to them to fix.
That's right. That's right. So we've got to look at the sustainability of not just the Great Barrier Reef, but also food, seafood industry, all of those. Our population growth is one thing that we've got to look at. Food and water to feed our projected population growth are going to be a very interesting space for the leaders of this country.
Yeah, particularly when they sit right up against marine spaces, and marine spaces that people value as well. People want to have clean waterways and intact reefs and beautiful inshore islands. I think everyone wants to have these places there into the future, as beautiful as we've managed to experience them. And I think for some of the inshore spaces as well, people don't realise it's actually quite shallow. It's very protected by the outer reef. There's not as much mixing, so there's really one of those environments that's what happens on the shoreline and in the catchments does end up right in front and can stay there.
Yes, I can't remember the name of the guy, but I watched a series on him on ABC where he did a lot of work with native landscaping, natural landscaping systems, and really, really interesting. And I think scientists are now looking at that work, because he's also done work, I believe, over in the United Emirates as well. And that's certainly something that I would see a space where we really, really need to be making inroads is, fixing soil erosion on properties and stuff like that. I think, and we've got to do it now, but advocacy and having the right people in place is the only way to move forward when we're putting all these strategies in place. So
yeah, exactly. And kind of building off the enthusiasm of students as well. You mentioned a couple of student projects. Kids love it. They love this. They love the Reef Guardians program. They're super enthusiastic, and we can actually learn from that enthusiasm that the kids have for these places and these programs. But that also fits really nicely with what you've been talking about, in terms of land management and weed eradication and soil stabilisation on islands as well that are close to the reef. They're really closely connected, and in places like Maggie. And you guys have had success with eradicating some of the weeds.
Look, I think it's quite important that we do look at how we utilise ag chemicals on native systems, and really make sure that we've got the residual effect that has on native land systems, to make sure we are utilising the right ag chemicals when we're treating weeds. And certainly you've got to look at, as this is where we can bring in volunteers to do another form of, managing weeds. Certainly, we got to chuck things under the microscope to say, okay, this program or this initiative didn't work, so let's put it under the microscope, and we'll just say, well, what were the issues and what were the roadblocks, why these things didn't work. It doesn't mean to say that let's not go with that program again, but if we don't identify what actually went wrong, then we can't fix and add value to, future projects. So I think with that's the most important thing in Australia right now, is we've got to look at all these different programs and strategies that are out there and identify where the roadblocks are. And it might be a case of an organisation not necessarily having the right building blocks to develop that program. Maybe they just need a little bit of help to go from 1 to 10 instead of 1 to 6.
Yeah, it is a lot to expect communities in rural and regional areas to have their capacity to do what the rest of us are probably asking to happen, to preserve places we want to enjoy. But those communities have less people, and they also probably have less resources available, which is something that probably needs to be addressed.
Yeah, look, and I think we can do that. One of the things that I look at is, do we leave it up to the one member that's in the local community to handle such a broad range of issues or problems that are in the community? How can we advocate and identify people that are really passionate to address those issues and fill in the gaps, so to speak? And if we do that and we throw those things under the microscope, and again, I always say this, identify what the roadblocks are, whether they are people or whether they are just the way that we delivered a community grant or a program or whatever the case may be. And we just need to identify it and then move forward. And people need to come to the table again. I mean, there's a lot of argy-bargy going on now throughout mainstream Australia over COVID, over business on different levels. But if people aren't willing to sit down at the table, and I encourage people to go to your local Indigenous corporation and ask questions and ask, okay, what's the meaning behind that name there? What's the connection between that mountain range and your people and stuff like that, and us as Indigenous people, we're developing capacity to work out business strategies and stuff like that the Western civilization has learnt over hundreds of years. So as Indigenous communities build capacity, there's certainly a chance to get to know who your neighbours are.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that also, I mean, there's lots, like you're saying, there's lots of challenges there, but that also means there's lots of opportunities for people to learn, try things in a new way and get involved at a local level with the communities that are there. What would you say, what do young people really need to know about the reef right now?
Well, they just got to know what the pressures are and what they're facing in the future. We've got all these plans in place, the reef protection plan, the 2050 plan. There's so many different plans, it sort of makes your head spin. But at the end of the day, it's about the longevity of, not just the Great Barrier Reef, but also all those inshore mangrove systems and some of the islands, the impacts that we bring upon them for either industrial or leisure times. So I guess if you don't know, then you just don't know. Yeah. The old saying, ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
But and that's why it's important that, part of the not just the government business, but the private sector is making sure that there is an education system in selling their products, what it means. Okay, this is your responsibility as a jet ski owner.
Yeah.
Okay. If you go to this island, make sure you're aware that, may potentially 50 metres out, that's where turtles have seagrass, all those sort of things that I think business owners really have to go to that next level, and a lot of them know that information.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that conversation, you just don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Don't know where to go with it. Excellent. You've talked a bit about building strong connections between people and place and Indigenous communities. How's the best way for people to go about doing that who really want to get involved?
I don't think it just it depends on one person. I think everybody, the onus is on us to build positive relationships with whether it be local government, state or federal, but, as long as the state and federal open up the communication channels, I think government departments themselves need to get better at our interdepartmental communications.
Yeah.
Okay, that space has really evolved. And that leads to joint programs. And also, I think one of the biggest problems with the workspace and our threshold, like everybody has a threshold of how many years they can work in a certain place, and then they become stagnant and they feel like they're not valued in the workplace.
Get overwhelmed.
And you get overwhelmed and you get bored, and people start to play up, I guess. But I certainly advocate for secondment through state departments to give government employees a chance to have a look at another department, how they work. It opens up positive mental space for people, and that's one of the things that's really important. Go to your local Indigenous corporation, go to your local government, talk with elders, and also, as Indigenous corporations, we're building capacity. Those conversations are certainly going to be forthcoming. And at the end of the day, certain individuals may not have talked with each other in the past, and those are roadblocks that people have to work through. And we can certainly move forward with opening up those communication channels, but we've just got to do it, and we've got to do it now. So I would certainly advise people to talk to your local Indigenous community to see if there's a chance for some collaborative partnerships, and they are out there. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, they are out there, and I can only talk on a certain of the different Indigenous people that I've been exposed to. So
yeah, no, it's great. What I really like from talking to you is what's come about is really that communication is really important, and that understanding that there is a really strong connection between what we do, what people do, what we do on the land, and what happens in the ocean. And it is within our control what happens next. Yeah,
and that's right. It's very important that we understand what our values are.
Yeah.
And if we don't have different values, well, there might be a couple that are out of line, but if there's values that are the same, then that's what we can build positive relationships on.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Troy. It's been lovely to talk to you and hear about your work on the Great Barrier Reef and the inshore islands. Thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Okay, thank you guys. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for listening to the Deep Blue On My Doorstep podcast. Don't forget to check out our website at events.unsw.edu.au, where you'll find all the photographs from this podcast series featuring the beautiful places that we've been discussing and the organisms found in these blue spaces.